probably the most valuable commodity in the world, attention, what we pay our attention to. And I think pay is the right word. And from a Christian point of view, the importance is because what we attend to forms us.
Hello and welcome to Reframing Education, the show exploring education with Christ at the centre. My name's James McKinnell.
And I'm Johnny Thomas, and today's episode, Teens and Screens. And we're delighted to be joined by Professor Glynn Harrison. Glynn, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Johnny. Thank you.
Glynn, you are Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Bristol, where you were the chair of the Department of Psychiatry and a practicing consultant psychiatrist. You were president of the International Federation of Psychiatric Epidemiology, and you were an advisor to the World Health Organization. You also preach and write, and many of us will be familiar with you through your books, such as The Big Ego Trip and A Better Story, where you've painted a positive vision for Christian orthodoxy amidst some of the pain of our culture, whether with respect to self-esteem or the sexual revolution. And in recent years, the impact of social media and smartphones has been a particular interest of yours. That's what we'd like to get into in today's conversation. Give us just a flavour. What has gripped epidemiologists like you in recent years?
You know, I think we owe a lot of the widespread public awareness in this area to psychologists, Jean Twenge, who's been writing for a few years, and particularly Jonathan Haidt, brilliant communicator. He's not only a very credible academic, social psychologist, public intellectual, he's also got a way with words. And I think his influence has been behind much of the public awareness, but also some of the political moves in recent years, the Australian ban on social media, or attempt to at any rate, and now some of our own moves in this UK on banning social media in schools. I'm an epidemiologist myself, and epidemiologists are interested in data, in information, and looking at big data sets, big studies that might allow us to unpack cause and effect.
Thank you. And Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, a number will have read that, and that stimulated a lot of conversation with parents and within schools and in church communities. For those that haven't read that, can you give us just one or two of the big headlines? 2010 being a year that he draws attention to. What were some of the trends that really drive forward this conversation?
His big point is that we are looking into the mouth of a huge mental health epidemic amongst young people especially. There are some frightening statistics out there. He's collected together a vast data set summarizing them. But I give you a flavor. In the UK, episodes of self-harm in the age 13 to 16 group has increased by 78% among girls between 2010 and 2018. That is a whopping increase. And it's quite measurable because you can measure the rate at which people are being admitted to hospital with self-harm, for example. Boys, 134% increase over that same time. Anxiety in age 11 to 15-year-olds up 62% in girls and 77% in boys. Depression up 140% in girls over that time. And what's intriguing is it's not just the UK and the US, which is very similar. It's the fabled Nordic countries, Sweden and Finland. And it's not simply Europe and the States. It's Western culture. So New Zealand, very similar, 138% increase in self-harm. So those are the kind of data here that interested Jonathan Haidt. And he looks around and he says, well, now what happened in, everything seems to have gone astray round about the year 2010, or at least accelerated. What happened in 2010, 2012? The smartphone reached a sort of tipping point in the number of kids who had them, used them, and the introduction of the forward-facing camera happened around the same time. So he puts those two things together, smartphone with the uptick in mental health. And I think actually the data he quotes are pretty good. I've looked at those. And most epidemiologists looking with a hard-nosed skepticism at this would agree there's something going on here. And it's been going on since about that time. So he's seen this correlation, you see, between two things. The question is, as we all know, does correlation mean causation? And this whole area is just really, really complicated. I mean, for example, we know that the consumption per capita of margarine in the US state of Maine correlates incredibly closely with the divorce rate. So, does margarine get you divorced? I doubt it very much. And yet we see these correlations. And this has been a cul-de-sac for lots of scientists and social scientists and policy makers, educational policy. You see a link and you assume the one causes the other. And that's where many statisticians and epidemiologists get much more cautious with Jonathan Haidt's claims.
Glynn, I heard you speak on this topic about a year ago in Cardiff. You were positive about Haidt's conclusions for how schools, how societies, how families might deal with this, but you described yourself as being cautious but not yet confident about agreeing entirely with his conclusions about correlation. And I'm just wondering, it's now been a couple of years since this book was published. Has the conversation moved on from that point? Is that still your position?
I don't think the thing is yet in the bag. And I'm afraid these claims have a habit over time of not being quite as clear as we once thought they were as other data comes in. And I think where we're going to land is that it's doubtless a contributory factor. The question is it the big contributory factor that Jonathan Haidt claims it is? I'm still not sure, although I still think that we should adopt his recommendations, which are pretty stark. But the reason I'm not sure, I'll just summarize briefly. First of all, the size of the correlation is painfully small. It's there over and over and over and over again, but it's in study after study, but it's not all that big. I mean, for example, we know there's a link between smoking and lung cancer. Your risk of getting lung cancer if you smoke is increased over 20 times the risk. Now that is what an epidemiologist, now that's an effect size. That's a link, that's really got people interested. The effect here is about half a time, 0.4, 0.5. This is painfully small given all the other things that we know can influence outcomes, So that's really one of the factors. The other factor another example would be reverse causation. We know there's a strong link between social media and depression. However, is that because social media makes you depressed, or is it because when you're depressed, you look at social media more? And the whole area is blighted by questions like these, and particularly one raised, well, what about all the other causes of mental health issues among young people? The one that nobody seems to want to talk about, but the evidence is there, family instability. That's a factor. The pandemic and its effect on kids, loss of schooling, the whole me culture that's grown over the past 20 years and the fragility that goes with it and the inward turn that we're encouraging our kids, so much introspection, and poverty. Poverty increases mental health issues by 2.5 times. See, that's an effect as well, 2.5 times. Not so. Jonathan Haidt, he's a bright guy. He'll push back on these. He'll say, well, it's the consistency of the findings, and poverty's been pretty stable, and all of this. Where we're going to find the real equation here is in interactions between one and the other. For example, social media may be impairing attention. It may be leading to sleeplessness and anxiety, say, in a young girl. And that's bad enough, I understand that. But if she is already in a family that's breaking up at the time, then she'll be driven into that world even more. If she's already poor and there's very little other resources available to her, then she's much more vulnerable. And so it's the interaction of these risk factors where I think we're going to eventually understand what's going on here. But that detailed work hasn't yet been done. That's where I think we are. The evidence is slowly moving, probably in Jonathan Haidt's direction. But as we go along, we're picking up more and more other factors that are involved.
And so are you saying then that social media and technology exacerbate lots of pre-existing things, other threads that might just be brought to the
Yes.
fore with technology. And so,
Yes.
so you'd come to the same conclusions with
Yes.
Haidt. So some of his things, for example, would be, waiting until around the age of 14 for a smartphone, or delaying social media till you're 16.
16.
Increasing unsupervised real world play, all those sorts of things. You would subscribe to that in that case because of the
Sure.
exacerbating factors.
Well, that and on there's a principle that's often applied in these sorts of situations where the evidence isn't yet in, and it's called the ethical precautionary principle. When activities appear to lead to morally unacceptable harm that is scientifically plausible but uncertain, actions should be taken to avoid or diminish harm. That is the precautionary principle, and I do think it applies here. And in the past, it's been of enormous benefit. For example, there was in the 40, 50, 60s years ago, the thalidomide scare, where tablets pregnant women were taken for morning sickness caused terrible deformities. The evidence of that link began to develop slowly, but some countries acted much more quickly to say there's something going on here and the effects are so harmful, we need to step in and do. And so they had fewer deformities overall. Others waited until the evidence really was cast iron and waterproof. And so that's an example of the way in which adopting that principle can be of real benefit. I do myself think it applies here, but you've got to be careful, because it was the precautionary principle that led people to close schools in COVID. And look, now we look back and we see the hugely harmful impact of that. So the precautionary principle, you've got to be very careful with it, but I do think it applies here. I really do.
Glynn, to play devil's advocate a little bit of...
Sure,
You've described factors other than technology, COVID, the family, possible family breakdown, poverty, the me culture, etc. I'm imagining someone hearing the simplicity of Jonathan Haidt's position of, look, forward-facing cameras, social media, smartphones, look at these changes in trajectories on some of these negative data sets that you described earlier. They all come at around the same time. You've described 4 or 5 factors that could all feature in. COVID didn't come till the end of the 2010s, so 2019, 2020. How would you explain the sudden changes in trajectory in light of those other factors?
Yes, no, it's all a gradual accumulation. So that's a fair pushback, and Jonathan Haidt himself has used that against Nature, the top scientific journal, gave his book a very negative review and said, we have here a terrific story searching for the data, for the evidence to support it. This is an ongoing debate, Johnny, and those are fair points. The point is, in interaction effects, you don't need to get an increase in an underlying risk factor for its interaction with another risk factor to increase the overall effect, if you see what I mean. So it's the fact that social media triggers or amplifies these other risk factors, which we'd be concerned about. My point is, let's not forget the other risk factors.
Brilliant. Here we're excited by educational vision that sees all things in relation to Christ, and you yourself are given to studying the human mind. You've done a huge amount on the health of the mind, and you see lots of that, it seems to me, through the lens of Christ. Is that right? Have you shaped your work because of your Christian faith, or rather, has your Christian faith made you a better psychiatrist, a better academic? And if so, how's that?
Yeah, I don't think it's made me a better academic, not in terms of the way these things are measured. I don't think I scored any higher in the rating mechanism because I was a Christian. I think better, though, in the sense that my Christian faith grounds my academic endeavor in quite a holistic way. I think human ingenuity, curiosity, the desire to make more of the world is right in line with the notion of who we are, built in the image of God. And that has motivated me, sustained me. And I've since I've been retired. I mean, emeritus is a wonderful term meaning retired. And since I've been retired, it's also been a wonderful way in which some of my experience as both an academic and a clinician can be used informally to talk about, well, things like this, and also to chat to people and get alongside people in various ways. So I think there are a number of ways that it's helped James, but not quite in the way that some people might think. You see, when you've got a hammer, everything's a nail. And one of the problems with being a surgeon or being a psychiatrist is that you begin to see everything through the lens of the method you are trained in. And psychiatry has what's called a medical model. It has an emphasis on the organic structures, the brain neuroscience and the way in which our brain affects behavior. The danger is that one then becomes unbalanced in the way one thinks about what it means to be human. And so the Christian faith has always pulled me back from thinking that, let's say, psychiatry answers more questions than it ever can. It answers questions from a certain point of view, but it doesn't provide the whole answer. Christian community is huge part of how we flourish as human beings. Let's work collaboratively. Let's use our different perspectives to complement each other rather than having some sort of, competition. It's really helped me in that way, I think. And in this area of social media, you see, well, I'll tell you my big concern, and I'd hate us to finish this podcast with a notion that this is all about banning stuff. iPhone, social media is one of the most wonderful products of human ingenuity. We are ingenious creatures sent out by God to make more of his world. And there's no doubt that the tech world is the product of our ingenuity. But what was it? I think it was Augustine who said the corruption of the best is the worst. And as we know, human ingenuity, our literary ingenuity, can produce the Bible, the works of Shakespeare, or it can produce Mein Kampf. And the human heart has always been vulnerable to using its own gifting in a perverse way. What I want to do here is say we have to teach kids and do that by example as much as by imposition. Teach kids how to use these well and how to, and to prepare themselves. Then you'll be ready to use it, just like driving a car. You learn how to drive the car before you go out and mow somebody down and kill them. And that learning, I remember I couldn't wait until I was 16 and starting, going to driving lessons and learning how to do this well, and then taking pride that you've learned how to handle a killing machine well. And it's just exactly the same here, I think. And it's a wonderful opportunity for teachers, parents, teach your kids how these things can work for benefit and how they can really come after you and destroy your life if you allow them to.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, to have the entire works of Shakespeare on your phone in your pocket, and you can dial a number and a taxi will arrive at your door and any type of food will arrive, all those sorts of things. And it feels to me that's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? We're living in an age at the moment where of enormous kind of ease and privilege in that sense. But I guess the battle for attention seems to be becoming the defining struggle of our age.
Yeah.
From a Christian perspective, attention, therefore, you're saying, isn't simply a cognitive issue. This isn't just going to rest there, but actually it's got moral and spiritual significance in the way that students, pupils, our children are shaped going forward.
Well, you're absolutely right there, aren't you? The probably the most valuable commodity in the world, attention, what we pay our attention to. And I think pay is the right word. We have 16 hours a day of waking time, and people are competing for our attention over that. And social media, of course, it doesn't come for free. We pay for it. We pay attention, and we pay for the social media with our attention. It's like handing over money to get the social media app, except you give them access to your field of attention so that they can then harvest and sell that on to advertisers. And we have the choice. How will we dispose of those 16 hours? We're making choices every day. And from a Christian point of view, the importance is because what we attend to forms us. Take, for example, our well-known human vulnerability to social mimesis or copying other people. We're deeply susceptible to social contagion, to behavioral contagion. So what we pay attention to does form the heart. And it's one of the great priorities of Scripture to think about what you're giving your attention to, because it's forming your heart, it's winning your heart, it's shaping our wanting, our desiring, and that shapes our lives. What we want is what we go for.
You mentioned Scripture there, Glynn. We have a standing question on the show of A Good Book and The Good Book. Is there a Scripture passage that has particularly influenced our guests as they reflect on these things? And is there a book that you'd like to draw to the attention of our listeners? A Good Book and The Good Book, over to you.
Yeah, well, a great verse in Scripture that I talk about time and time again is Proverbs 4:23. Guard your heart. Just 3 words. Guard your heart. But it's preceded by another little phrase, above all else, guard your heart. Why? Because for everything you do flows from it. And that is a profound psychological insight. The heart as the wanting side to us. We are fundamentally wanting creatures. Take a newborn baby. Within a few hours, it has no cognitive structure yet. It has all the tools for acquiring words and concepts, but it doesn't have any. And so a newborn baby doesn't know what he thinks yet, but he knows what he wants automatically. He wants his mum. He wants to feed. He wants the two to come together in a desirable breastful of milk. That is an example of that powerful drive we have, even from birth. And that lasts all through our lives. We are wanting creatures. We are driven out into the world by our desire to build something, to make something of the world. And of course, that reflects the image of God in us. And that's what makes what we pay attention to so important, because God desires that we want the best that will lead to our flourishing, which is that we desire him in the end. So social media, its mission, as driven by secular, what we might call in Christian, worldly or other distractions, it wants to distract us from the great mission of the Christian life, to put God at the center, to be all that he calls us to be, into whatever will hold our attention. And it'll do anything to hold our attention.
And a good book, Glynn, a book you've enjoyed that you'd like to draw people's attention to?
Yeah, I think I'm going to say Jonathan Haidt's book. Just be wary over the claims of a link. He spends a lot of time explaining the mechanisms by which social media disrupts and disturbs our mental health. And I think those mechanisms are plausible and really helpful. And it's well written, it's beautifully crafted, and he's a great communicator. Catherine Hill and the Christian Sphere has written a book, Left to Their Own Devices, which I think is a useful book. And Left to Their Own Devices isn't explicitly Christian, but it's implicitly Christian. It has a lot of good tips for parents. And you'll also find on the Care for the Family website a social media contract. And one of the suggestions they have is download the contract and then as a family sit around and decide how you're going to do social media better together. It's not just about parents telling the kids to stop it. It's about how do we as a family function in a way that will lead us to flourish together. And I love that kind of thought. So
we'd had at our church a lunch some months back of parents getting together to talk about some of these things, and people have made different decisions with their own family and their own children, and it was wonderful hearing people unpack what they had done and why. And there were one or two families who'd gone down that route, Glynn, of a contract with their children as they introduced a phone. And it's great to talk about these things.
Isn't it? It's one of the great challenges of the formation of our kids. We parents will account for that precious, extraordinary task that God's given us. And this is one of the first and foremost areas that we should be thinking about. The only other thing I'd say is, you notice we haven't mentioned pornography or, people who get onto these platforms and dangerous to our kids. We should mention that. But we often, and Christians often do this, go quickly to the bad stuff that comes through. I think that as much destruction is caused by the way these things undermine our self-control, they play with our attention span, they undermine our ability to focus. I think for kids' mental health, those things are as much, maybe more important than some of the extreme material that these things channel toward us. So need to think about both of those things. Again, it's not about banning stuff and stopping stuff.
So we will have lots of parents and school leaders listening to this, and you've talked about all sorts of themes that we could pull on today, but in terms of some practical areas that they might usefully reflect on, perhaps negatively in terms of, perhaps withholding smartphones or social media, or positively, encouraging more risk or grounding identity. What sorts of things would you suggest from a practical perspective that we could suggest to parents and school leaders to tackle some of these things and how we approach it?
Sure. Yeah. That's slightly different for those two groups, I guess, James. Just think about parents for a moment. I again, re-emphasizing this is something you do together with your kids. I've got a photo of family in an airport queue, and there are two adults and two kids. The kids clearly haven't been given smartphones, and they're staring out of the window as we're waiting to board the plane. A long wait too, that one was. They're waiting, and the kids are bored silly. Why? Because mum and dad are on the phones. This is totally unacceptable. We must lead by example. And so you start with yourself, I'd say to parents. What are your issues with this? How much time a day are you giving away to social media apps on trivia and distraction when God has a great claim on our hearts? And what are the habits that social media is forming you into? How is it undermining your self-control? Do some of that thinking and then think about how you can help prepare your kids. The other thing is, bear in mind, you're in charge of one of the most wonderful, in fact, the most wonderful thing in the universe, which is your kid's brain sitting there in their head. 5 billion neurons. And they're growing and developing. And between the ages of 12 to 16, some of the most important development work is going on. And your task is to help do everything possible for your kids' frontal lobes, the parts that are behind the more subtle aspects of personality, to read the room, to act appropriately, to put a stop on impulses. And you have those wonderful opportunities of formation. You've only got them once, then they'll be gone. You will never get them back. So I'd say as a parent, look into your own heart and then attend to this intentionally. It's one of the greatest tasks of parenthood. How are we going to teach our kids to be tech-wise, to be smart? I would counsel any parent not to give a smartphone until at least age 14, and certainly not to have social media apps other than WhatsApp, probably, that's, carefully managed, and YouTube. But you've got YouTube. There's a lot of devices in there for holding your attention that are not helpful. So just be careful about those things, but certainly Snapchat and the other things I'd say not until 16. And then there are a number of tricks, as you say. Family, I think a family contract, really good. There are a number of tricks you want to teach your kids, which is, for example, always switch off notifications. Do not give some tech firm in California the right to disrupt your attention every few minutes with a ping. This will fragment your attention and undermine your ability to focus. So switch off notifications. You should never scroll unless you label it clearly as my scrolling behavior and my scrolling time. So scrolling is one of the most dangerous to the mind, to the way our attention works, because they're throwing things like a machine gun at you. They're They're throwing things that will tickle your curiosity, draw it in. And we are very curious creatures who love novelty, and it will fragment attention even more. So don't do scrolling unless you give yourself 10 minutes scroll. I give myself 10 minutes scrolling time, then try and stop at the end of that. I'd really recommend a weekly Sabbath of phones. To be honest, my wife and we've adopted fairly recently, late in life, a proper, we've started Sabbathing, not because we think it's a law for a Christian, but we think it's a means of flourishing as human beings on one day of the week to think there are lots of things I can do differently today. How am I going to do that? So, 6 o'clock on a Saturday evening until 6 o'clock Sunday evening. And 6 o'clock, my wife lights a candle and I pray some prayers as we usher in this period. And I slightly ceremoniously put my phone to one side. And that is now out of my sphere of attention for the next 24 hours. And you notice initially, like all fasting, whether it's food or anything else, when you fast for something, it's a wonderful way of measuring the strength of your attachment to things. So you realize as your hand reaches out to where it should be, without even thinking about it, it's not there anymore. You are really attached. You've been well trained by those social media apps, like a rat in a cage or a dog performing in a circus. And you notice the strength of those, and gradually you find the inner strength with prayer to say, I'm getting better all the time at saying no to notifications, and saying yes to the wonderful gift these things are. Like I do my banking through it, and I get to give talks, and I get there on time and to the right place because of the wonderful GMAPs and all the other things which I thank God for and celebrate. And the big one, of course, is free play in a risky world. Your kids have got to be got out of the virtual world and into the real world, because it's in learning to navigate risk in the real world that they'll acquire the skills to navigate risk in the artificial world, in the virtual world. And there's a lot of evidence that we need risk. You've got to be exposed to risk to learn at what level you react to it, And so you've got to let your kids take a few risks and get them out there playing and roughing a little bit and taking, yeah.
The weekly Sabbath idea is a lovely one. And I have a family at our church chatting to the other day who introduced what they call Quiet Tuesday, where as a family they all just sit around in the sitting room, get the books out, light the fire, and just sit and quietly and enjoy that time together reading. And these sorts of rhythms to life can be formative.
God rests on the seventh day. It's a pattern, and I think to use it particularly for testing the strength of one's attachments is really helpful. Really helpful. I find it helpful, and you can realize the extent to which this is gaining control of your heart, and then take steps to combat that. One of the great steps of being overattached is detachment. Jesus said, if you have a propensity to seek out the best seat at the feast, go down to the bottom seat. And both of these are ways of practicing detachment from the things that have lured us and got control of our attentional world, and therefore forming us. So lots of interesting spiritual habits and practices can grow out of this more widely, actually, in the areas of physical appetite for food, greed, that's a real issue, I think, for our society and for our church, and some of the other disorders of appetite that we all struggle with. Yeah. I mean, schools have lots of, you have to bespoke your interventions to the particular school culture. I was doing a talk along these lines at a school a while back, and they were saying that they really had a no phones in school policy, and I think you had to hand them in at that one. Others have these pouches that lock, and, there are all sorts of devices you can get and the genius ways of preventing access. But they found that because a lot of kids took school buses in, they were just sitting on their phone glued to optimize the available time before the lockdown came, you see. And so they've now extended it to the buses as well, because they want the kids to talk to each other on the buses and socialize and so on. So our school's putting as much effort into what I'd call tech resilience classes, building kids' resilience to the harmful effects of these things so that they can learn to use them optimally when they do get to that age. We're not just against, we're for, healthy use of phones for our kids. There must be some really imaginative things one can do to build tech resilience, to build smart kids and to get them thinking in this way. You could nest it in a broader curriculum around the mastery of appetite. A lot of kids are getting fat. We have alcoholics. We have all kinds of disorders of appetite out there, whereby in our formation of our kids, we could see that as an area that we could help them with.
Glynn, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really rich discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Reframing Education. We exist to open up conversations about Christ-centred education within the UK. We host fortnightly interviews to inspire and equip educators and parents and leaders as we explore the big question: what is the purpose of education?
So follow, like, share, leave a review. It all helps grow the conversation. And check out the show notes for other ways to support and connect. And thank you for listening. And until next time, may God fill education with the colour of Christ as we're drawn to the praise and love of our Creator.